Next point. Like Jesus, our ministry or ministries must be ministries of both preaching or speaking the good news and doing good deeds. Verse 39, and Jesus went throughout all Galilee, preaching in their synagogues and casting out demons. Now, we know throughout Jesus' ministry, he fed people, he healed people, he cast out demons, he raised the dead, or at least resuscitated. Yeah, he raised the dead. And it's a focus, I think Penny had touched on it earlier, that the ministry of the word comes first, but it's always or usually accompanied by a ministry of deeds. Jesus was preaching in their synagogues and casting out demons. It wasn't just Jesus preaching, although at times he did that. And it isn't just Jesus healing people or casting out demons. Throughout the ministry, these two might not be together every single instance in the Gospels, but they're together an awful lot. And one may appear where the other doesn't, the other may appear where the first doesn't. But it's the idea that one of the things we learn from Jesus is the ministry of the Word, the good news, who Jesus is, what he has done, truth about Scripture, the people of God, and the world in which we live, really must be accompanied by good deeds. We don't do the same kind of deeds that Jesus does. We can pray for people to be healed in Jesus' name, but Jesus didn't miss. We don't have that kind of authority, that kind of power. If we did, we would be as successful as Jesus is. I mean, there's no doubt about that. So why do we need both the words of the gospel and deeds? And what problems would we face, or do we face, or does the church face, say, when there are only words and no deeds, or only deeds and no words of truth, no gospel message?
Well, I think, one of the answers to that is it really keys off of what Penny said before, that if you the words are incredibly important. There's no doubting that. But she said we generally learn by experience. There have been a lot of studies that have done that if you just hear something, you retain a certain percentage. I no
6%.
longer remember what the percentage. Thank you.
Well, we were told in seminary, look, people are only going to remember 6% of what you... And I'm thinking, why am I paying for this?
6% of what you hear. So, and then I think that's why when I take notes, and I'm doing it today on my phone, and Sylvia's doing it in her book, which is often how I do it, writing things down helps me, because now not only have I heard it, but now I'm using the kinesthetic to actually write it down, and I can read it later. And if you experience something, if you physically go through something, you are going to remember that so much greater than if you just had somebody tell it to you. We can all think of times in our lives when we have been through an experience, and you often say, there's no way I'm ever forgetting that. And I think if all we do is speak to people, it's nice that we're telling them the good news, but if we can live it and share it with them, show them, that's going to speak much more deeply to them than are just, conveying it through words.
Good, absolutely. Anyone else on that? Okay, well, let's move on to number 5. In the Gospel of Mark, Jesus is the only one who shows compassion. I'm going to read 40 through 42. We're moving on to Jesus when he cleanses a leper. And a leper came to Jesus, imploring him, and kneeling said to him, "If you will, you can make me clean." Moved with pity, he stretched out his hand and touched him and said to him, "I will be clean." And immediately the leprosy left him, and he was made clean. If you read the Gospel of Mark all the way through, Jesus is the only one who demonstrates this kind of compassion. He's having pity. And one of the reasons why that's important is because compassion is a sign of Jesus' deity. And since God's compassionate, we're compassionate. And we're compassionate because God is compassionate. And that's important for us to connect really any expression of human compassion back to its source. Humans aren't innately compassionate. If we are, then it's because it comes from who God is. What I want you to see here also is the relationship between Jesus' compassion and his firmness and his directness. Showing compassion and being firm and direct are not mutually exclusive, they're compatible. Sometimes you'll see people who are very compassionate, but they might not be able to take a stand, or people take advantage of them. Some people, when Jesus healed 10 lepers in another setting, only one came back to say thank you. But Jesus said, where are the others? Well, how come only this guy, and he's a Samaritan? But you really couldn't do that with Jesus. Look how in verse 41, I love the way it's communicated. It's great to imagine it. Moved with pity, Jesus stretched out his hand and touched him. You just don't touch a leper. You don't. And the reason why is, the uncleanliness of it. But Jesus would transmit cleanliness. He wouldn't become unclean. The Old Testament law was the opposite, that if you touched him, you'd become unclean. So Jesus moved with pity, stretched out his hand and touched him. It's very warm. It's very personal. Jesus is very engaging. And he said, I will be clean. And immediately the leprosy left him, and he was made clean. Okay, you stop there and think, wow, Jesus reached out, he touched this man, said to him, be clean. It's warm, it's personal, he heals him. And then in verse 43, it says, and Jesus sternly charged him and sent him away at once and said, see that you say nothing to anyone, but go show yourself to the priests and offer for your cleansing what Moses commanded for a proof to them. And so you have both. You have both this compassion. He's warm. He touches somebody who was unclean. And as we'll see in a little bit what that meant, if you go back to Leviticus chapter 14, which I'm not going to do because it's a long passage, you'll see what the healed leper was supposed to do in presenting himself to the priest, so the priest could really officially, his cleansing would be recognized, and then he would no longer be a social outcast. He'd be reinstated socially. So it's both compassion, and then yet Jesus can be stern. So that's important. I think that balance. Compassion without an appropriate sternness at times. Doesn't mean every time we show compassion we have to be stern. But to be compassionate also, we want to remember there are times to be stern. How much are you going to give, you're going to help somebody before they begin to take notice, hey, I should probably be doing something for myself here. That's part of the deal. And yet, to be stern without compassion is not good all the time. Jesus balances those. And the disciples would have seen this. So in the appropriate context, there's compassion and there's sternness. Now, there's a reason for it, as Jesus, as we'll see, didn't want this man to do certain things. So what do you think about that balance in life? What do you think we learn about Jesus, at least in this passage, with respect to balancing compassion and sternness in this context? And what might be the disadvantage of being compassionate without being stern, or being stern without being compassionate?
Well, it shows his authority to go beyond the act of healing. And he gave him something to go do at the priest. So it came with a consequence as far as that goes. But I think it shows his authority.
Mm-hmm. Right, it does. Yeah, authority to heal, and this is what you need to do next.
I think it's interesting, the other reference where he heals, like you talked about, the other 10 lepers and the Samaritan that came back, and how he spoke, go along the way, do this. But here he touches him, showing a completely different mode of healing. One is with obedience, because he was trying to get to the real heart of the matter, which was the person. The healing wasn't really it. He wanted to see who was going to really see him for who he was, had the spiritual eyes, where this man already had seen him. I mean, he was basically begging for mercy. He wanted to see him. Jesus was presenting another mode of healing to show, I think this man's heart was already bowing before him, where he wanted to see if the other men had been bowing before him, and where would that leave them once he did the healing. So 2 different instances, but here you see the sternness, like you said. I think a lot of us in the West would probably be very compassionate and not as stern. I think a lot of us, well, probably depending geographically where you live, but I think we tend to give more. We see someone who needs something and we want to give, but then we don't know what else to do with that, so we just give and that's it. I mean, we don't really have maybe a word that we should give to them of encouragement, like how can you here are some phone numbers, or here's a place where you need to go to try to get more direction for your life, and things like that. Get a little bit more involved. But I would say the compassion is probably more the air for me anyway.
Yeah.
You know how I like to talk about the throwaway line. So what I'm reading and realizing, and you touched on it, but you kind of glossed over it. And
I may get there in the next point, Don.
maybe I better not. Maybe I'll wait.
Don't deny me that as a possibility.
I'm going to wait then.
Say it. I may not get there.
Well, Jesus reached out his hand and touched the man. And you made the comment that in the Old Testament, when you touched somebody that was dirty, you were now dirty, and now you had to go through all of these gyrations to get yourself back into a holy place. Jesus does the complete opposite. And the other thing that I find interesting about it is that he would have run into this man along the way. He wouldn't have seen him in the synagogue because he wouldn't have been welcomed in the synagogue. So this could have been on the trail, or some back alley of some street as they were going from one place to the next. He sees this man, he reaches out his hand, and he touches him. Total opposite of the Old Testament theology and law. Yet, at the same time, he tells him to do what Moses told him he should do. I find it all very interesting. But that fact that he reached out his hand and touched him, that's no throwaway line. That's an important point to show you the way people used to live and how I want you to live now.
No question.
And we as a society, we lived through that. I don't remember the years, but we lived through that with the AIDS epidemic. You didn't touch him. Very few people didn't touch him.
That's good. I think something to see here, too, is who Jesus is based on the New Testament account. He is Yahweh, the God of the Old Testament, in-fleshed. He is. And so the only way to access Yahweh under the Old Covenant would have been early on via the sacrificial system. And once a year, the high priest in Leviticus 16 was welcomed on the Day of Atonement into the Holy of Holies to sprinkle blood on the propitiatory seat or on the mercy seat. And the blood being on the seat within the ark were the 10 Commandments. So when those 10 Commandments were broken, the sin of the nation was now seen through the blood that was sprinkled there, and there was forgiveness. But now you have that self-same God, Jesus, who will go to the cross, and en route to the cross. So the God of the Old Testament enfleshed is now on the move. So there's that, like we've talked about before, centrifugal. God is now going out. In the Old Testament, it was centripetal. People had to come to the temple with their sacrifices. He's going out and he's actually making physical contact with people. Mind-blowing if you understand who this God is. He's touching human beings. Some human beings won't touch other human beings, even if they're not unclean. And that uncleanness is not going to keep God. It's not going to be a barrier to who God is now. He's going to reach through that uncleanness and heal this person and make him new. It's really amazing stuff. Was anybody next?